Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. The arcade was famous for having some of the best games of the 80s and 90s, and a big part of that was the beat-em-up genre, thanks to the likes of Final Fight, Turtles, X-Men and so on. There were a ton of them released, and some of them found their way onto home consoles like the SNES and Mega Drive, but not all of them. So yeah, in this video we're going to take a look at a handful of games that were only ever released at the arcade. Though, knowing my luck, most of them probably had a console release in a compilation, but I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments below. Now, how about I shut up, you press that subscribe button, and we take a look at some games. First up is Metamorphic Force from Konami. This is an awesome beat 'em up for up to 4 players, depending on the cabinet, or more realistically, the ROM set you have. The story here is that the evil king, and yes, that is his name, has come back to rule the kingdom of horror. Honestly, this was written by a child, but I love it. So the 4 guardians of the realm, Ben, Max, Claude and Ivan, do their sworn duty as the Metamorphic Guardians and set out to defeat the evil king and his army of vile creatures. Now, all the games in this video do play pretty similarly, and I'm sure most of you have played a beat 'em up or two, so you already know what to expect from the gameplay, so don't expect much variety here. And yeah, Metamorphic Force plays just like you'd expect. You choose from one of the 4 characters, and then you set out across a bunch of levels punching everything in the face. But man, this game is just so much fun. The gimmick here is that the game is a cross between Final Fight and Altered Beast. You start in human mode, where each of the characters plays pretty well and have the usual speed, strength and hit point differences. Then at some point in the level you'll meet a monkey kid thing with a big sack. He'll drop power-ups, and if you get the statue of the woman, you turn into your beast form, where you'll deal more damage and take less. If you collect another one of these statues while in beast mode, you do a screen clearing attack, which is awesome. The characters do all play the same though. You only have 2 buttons, a jump and an attack. Pressing both of them at the same time lands an attack on all enemies, but you take a bit of damage. Now, you can't stay in beast form forever, it has a timer, though this goes down slowly and can be refilled with items. In fact, I only fell out of beast mode a couple of times, and while you are noticeably weaker, especially on the later levels, the human forms are far from useless. The game looks absolutely stunning in my opinion. The graphics are fantastic with some amazing sprite work and animation, and the whole thing looks like a cartoon, and I really think it should have been made into one. The beast forms are all great, and the enemy and boss designs are excellent. The levels are all varied and have a lot going on too. I never got bored here, and I couldn't wait to see what was coming up next. The controls are spot on. In fact, I think the controls and hit detection here are some of the best from Konami beat 'em ups, and I'd say that this is even better in this respect than with The Simpsons, Turtles and X-Men. In fact, I'd actually say this is a better game than all those games as it is. The music here is also great and has a real Saturday morning cartoon feel to it. Overall, this is just a fantastic beat 'em up, and it really is a shame it never came home to any systems. It would have been great on the 32-bit consoles, and is one of those series that I would have loved to see a few games for. Imagine a 3D story-driven game like God of War with these characters. Imagine. Anyway, this is a must-play. Fire up some MAME and check it out today. Crime Fighters, also from Konami, is one of their earlier beat-em-ups from 1989. This one has the classic story of an evil gang that have kidnapped a load of women, so you have to set out to rescue them over a bunch of levels. Being an early beat-em-up, I expected this to be very simple, but in fact it's actually quite the opposite, well, for a game like this. Here you have 3 buttons. You can punch, kick and have a button that attacks behind you. Pressing punch and kick at the same time makes you do a cool spin, kick, jump thing, but thankfully there's no annoying platform here, it's all just beating up. You fight your way through 8 or so quite large levels, each of them being packed with a ton of really tough enemies. This is not a forgiving game. Most levels introduce new enemies, which is nice, and by the time you get to the last level, you'll be dealing with punks, karate men, wrestlers, people with guns, and of course leather-clad women with whips. Thankfully, you're quite good at punching people in the face. Your punch and kick buttons each do their own combos, and in fact there are multiple combos per button that differ depending on the directions pressed and the type of enemy you're fighting. Kicking is more powerful, but a hell of a lot slower, and you really have to get the timing down well for kick combos. I did find that most of the time I got hit while I was trying to use them, so didn't really bother. I stuck to punches for the most part. What's cool though is that you can usually hit enemies that are on the floor as well. This is pretty powerful, and you'll want to use it a lot when you're not surrounded. Enemies also drop weapons, so you'll be able to pick up knives, pipes and even a gun. The knife and pipe basically work the same but have a different range, with the pipe being a lot longer. But both knock down enemies in one hit, which is handy for getting yourself some breathing space. The gun is easily the best though, letting you take out enemies from miles away and you get unlimited ammo. Annoyingly, the hit detection here isn't really the best. For the most part it's fine, but there were a lot more times than I would have liked where I'd be swinging wildly at the air and getting my ass kicked, even though I was definitely hitting the enemies. Also, enemies have a nasty tendency of just ignoring your attacks and punching you mid-combo. This makes the enemies like the karate people and wrestlers incredibly hard to fight, and often these two enemies are paired together. Each level ends in a boss fight of course, and these are wildly unbalanced. Some of them kill me 5 or 6 times, whereas others seem to die almost instantly. I mean, it's not really a problem on MAME, but you know what I mean. What surprised me is the amount of quirky things in the games. There's times when you'll get squashed and your sprite is flattened like a pancake. You can also get electrocuted and see your skeleton, or be kicked in the nuts, complete with a ding sound. It really gives the game some character. Also, for some reason, every level has a little saucy element to it, be it a poster with some cleavage, sexy enemies, or even one of the levels that has a strip club with a hot woman at the door, but when you go over to her, the bouncer from the club comes and slams the door in your face. It's little touches like this that go a long way to making it fun to play. And I would say that this is one to play. It looks decent for an 80s brawler, with small detailed characters and very smooth animation, and there's always a lot going on. Oh, and it does have one thing that really annoyed me though. If you die against the final boss, you can't continue and have to start from the beginning. So I've actually not managed to beat this one yet, and probably never will bother. But this is a good one to play, especially with a friend. Here is Arabian Fight from Sega. This also has the classic story of a group of 4 warriors who have to rescue a princess who's been captured and is going to be offered as a sacrifice. This time though, rather than exploring boring modern streets, here you set out around some more exotic locales like Arabian towns, deserts, castles and even a few magic carpet rides. The variety in the levels here is a lot of fun, and the 4 characters are all decent enough too, and I didn't really have a favourite. You only have 2 buttons to worry about, attack and jump of course. Pressing them together attacks in front and behind, and actually you do have a 3rd button, and that uses your magic. Characters have the usual attacks and combos that are done by hammering the button, and pressing the different directions while you attack actually does different attacks, though this wasn't all that useful. You can run and have different running and jumping attacks for each character. The magic is also basically the same for everyone, which is a bit of a shame, but there are a few different magic attacks, though I couldn't actually tell how I made it do different ones. The animations for these are great though, with each one of them seeing your character jump towards the screen in a genuinely impressive animation that looks like a proper cartoon. In fact, that is something that sets this game apart from a lot of the others. The way everything scrolls and the characters actually scale as you move up and down on the screen. It looks great, and the enemies will appear right up against the screen and jump into the background. And likewise, you can sometimes throw enemies towards the screen, and it always just looks quite impressive. Actually, the game just looks great all the way through. The sprites are all excellent, and the animation is very good. I really like the number of enemies you meet as well. There's a ton of different ones, and each level has its own unique boss of course. You'll be fighting regular people, as well as skeletons, demons, mummies and lizard lady things. It's great. Well, it would be if the hit detection wasn't so piss poor, and practically ruins the whole thing. You see, hitting an enemy only seems to register about 30% of the time. I found it almost impossible to land a full combo, and most of your attacks are just completely ignored by enemies. Couple this with some really terrible hit detection from them, whereby they'll hit you when you're not on the same plane as them, or when you're stood behind them, or when you're of course in the middle of an attack, and it makes killing most enemies almost impossible without taking damage. It gets annoying very quickly, especially as you're almost always surrounded by enemies that take quite a few hits. It's a real shame, and actually a big surprise, as it's a Sega game. On paper, everything about this game is great, except the hit detection. Also, they really had an opportunity to do some awesome Arabian themed music here, but instead you get generic butt rock. It's a real shame. The one thing that makes this hard to recommend is that the game just doesn't feel finished, and makes it hard to play. And it makes what should be a must play into a game that it just looks great, but isn't really one that I'd recommend. If you have the patience, then fine, give it a go, but I'm sad to say that this is definitely the worst game in this video by quite some way. Night Slashers is what you get if you cross Final Fight with Castlevania, sort of. It's a beat 'em up where Dracula is up to no good and has of course got the help of a ton of other monster types like Frankenstein and his monster, Wolfman, and a load of zombies, werewolves, mudmen and evil spirits. So the Night Slashers, a group of monster hunters with a bunch of combat experience, come in to save the day. Something I really like about this one is that it's set in modern times, whereas normally games like this are set in the good old days. So you'll be fighting all sorts of demons in cities, skyscrapers, modern labs and things like that, rather than run-down dilapidated old castles, which I still love of course. Your three characters here have the usual tropes of the all-rounder, the faster but weaker one, which of course is the female, and the slow but very strong bloke with robot arms. As well as your standard button mashing combos and run attacks, you can hold down the attack button to charge a special move. This does take a few seconds and will leave you vulnerable, but it doesn't make you lose any health. These moves tend to be dash attacks that are good for clearing some room, though don't seem that powerful. You do of course have your move that you do by pressing both buttons at the same time that you want to use when you're in trouble. It will take some of your health, but it normally is less than what you take from the enemies. Also, something I really like here is that if you jump, hold down and then attack while you're in the air, you can smash most enemies into the ground so just their head is visible, and then kick them till their heads explode. And you know what, that's one of the game's biggest appeals, the fact that most of the enemies explode in a torrent of blood and guts. It's exactly what you want to see in a game like this, and it's spot on. Thankfully, the graphics are all round great, and I love all the enemies, but I am always a sucker for anything of this style of horror. The controls are also perfect. It feels just like a Final Fight game, but this is from Data East and not Capcom, but you can really see the influences. It's not an easy game, and a lot of the enemies take a ton of hits and can be quite cheap. The bosses especially will kill you in just a few hits and will often ignore your attacks, as bosses in these types of games tend to do. It is very annoying, but let's face it, we all have unlimited continues these days. This is definitely a must play for anyone who likes horror or 80s camp style stuff, and I would definitely be one to crack out on Halloween. Ninja Baseball Batman is a very popular arcade brawler that's now got itself something of a cult following since the rise of MAME. There is a story about a bunch of evil sports related stuff causing havoc, so Ninja Baseball Batman and his mates do the usual beat 'em up thing of traversing 8 or so levels, beating the snot out of anything and anyone that decides they want to get in the way. The game sets out to be as wacky as possible and does not take itself seriously at all, and this is something that really works in its favour. The characters are all baseball related, and of course you have the tropes that you already know about. They do play different enough though, and you will have a favourite, which is always good. For me, it was either the regular red bloke or Roger, the big yellow guy. He was great fun. But to be fair, I'd take any of the characters. The levels are all bright and colourful and often have a ton of stuff going on in the background, and enemies will come at you from all over the place, and the variety in enemies is surprisingly good here. Almost all of them are sport related, being baseballs, gloves and bats of various shapes, sizes and colours, and of course all the bosses are all massive and tend to be vehicles for some reason, seeing you fight massive cars and even a plane inside a plane. The combat here is kinda basic, with just your usual one button for attacks, mash it for the combo, and you have a few running and jumping attacks as well. Pressing both buttons does deplete your health, but it will save you in a bind. There are a few items you can collect here, most of which are baseballs you can throw or hit at enemies for massive damage. It would have been nice if there was more things to use, but to be fair, I didn't really notice when I was playing that there weren't that much. As you can see, the graphics are just fantastic, the art style is awesome, and the characters, enemies and levels all look great, with some excellent animation and so much crazy stuff going on all the time that I really don't get bored of playing this one, which is something that is so easily happens in these kinds of beat 'em ups. The controls, of course, are also silky smooth and responsive. The hit detection is spot on, and the combat just feels great. Each of the characters has cool animations and attacks, and it means you won't get bored, and the game just has so much damn charm that it's hard not to have a smile on your face when you play it. While it doesn't really do anything new or groundbreaking, and when you look at it, it is actually kind of a basic beat 'em up, it is just so much fun and easily one of the best in the video. I highly recommend checking this one out, especially if you can get along a friend. Shadow Force from Technos was released in 1993. This is a pretty unique beat 'em up, but not in the story department. That's about as generic as it comes, and you don't really need me to tell you what it's about. Anyway, you get to choose from a selection of ninjas, as well as a dog monster thing called Coyote, and then, yeah, you set out on a bunch of levels fighting enemies. This one does really stand out though for having a few unique mechanics. First of all, the way the combat works is more like a one-on-one fighter. When you're close to an enemy, you are always facing them, letting you walk backwards, and holding back lets you block their attacks. This also means that a lot of the controls are more like Street Fighter, and you can actually do quite a few special moves per character, which is really cool. But one of the biggest things here is that you can actually absorb and transform into pretty much any of the enemies in the game, each of which have their own movesets and special attacks, which are shown to you on screen when you transform. Now, some of the characters are great and some not so much. But be careful, as when you die when playing as an enemy character, you don't just change back. Well, you do change back, but you will also lose a life. I do really like this mechanic, though you don't have to use it if you don't want to. It would have been nice if there were some sections of the game where you need to be a certain character to use a certain ability, but I never saw it. Graphics wise, this is decent. It's got smaller sprites, and while the animation isn't as smooth as some of the games we've seen, it's still good enough. Character designs are all pretty appealing, and all the levels, well, pretty much what you'd expect to see in a game like this, are all fine. The music is kinda lame though, which is a shame. I did expect a bit more on that front. But the controls are good and the combat is solid. This is a pretty tough game though, especially some of the bosses, who are kinda cheap, and sometimes enemies will just ignore your attacks. But it's never enough to ruin what is otherwise a pretty damn fun game. This really did surprise me that it didn't come out on a console. It looks just like a SNES game, and it would have been great on that system. But oh well, we can all play it this way now. And finally for today, here is Violent Storm, another one from Konami. I probably should have just made this into a Konami beat 'em ups video. Oh well. You'll never guess the story here. That's right, your woman has been kidnapped, so off you go to get her. And man, this game is a ton of fun. I've said ton a lot in this video, sorry. There's 3 generic beefcake characters to choose from, Wade, Boris and Kyle, and yeah, you have the all-rounder, the strong slow one and the fast weaker one, but they all are really good fun to play as. The game's got a bit of a Mad Max post-apocalyptic 80s vibe to it that I really like. The outfits and characters all look great, and the levels are all sort of dilapidated cities and wastelands, and it just works really well with the tongue-in-cheek style of everything. You only have 2 buttons to worry about again, attack and jump, and yeah, you can do the attack that covers both sides of you at the expense of some health if you need to. You can also attack behind you if you need to with a backhand that knocks down most enemies. This is another game that doesn't really do anything new or groundbreaking, but what it does, it just does very well. Graphically, I really like the style here, and the sprites are massive with great animation, though the colours are a little washed out, but it still looks good. There's a lot going on in the levels with characters in the background, and they're watching everything that's going on. The designs, as mentioned, are all just so fun too, with massive crazy bosses being a highlight. The controls and combat are both excellent, with some super smooth responsive controls, and yeah, it is basic with your standard combos and a handful of weapons to use, but the game is pretty short, I think being the shortest in this video, and actually made me want another couple of the levels, rather than thinking it was dragging, and that's not really something that happens in these games. What also helps is that the music here is just awesome, with some great 80s style tracks really helping complement the action. Of course, playing this one with a friend would be the way to go, and this is another one that I would highly recommend checking out. So there you go, a handful of arcade-only beat-em-ups that you may or may not want to try out. I'm a fan of these types of games, and I know there's a ton more out there. I left out some of the more commonly known ones like Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, but that is another one that you should definitely check out. And I really can't believe a lot of these didn't get a release on any consoles, but thank goodness for emulation, eh? Anyway, what are some of your favourite games like this, and what are some others that I should check out? As always, let me know in the comments below. Now, all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.